Hello everyone, welcome to Methods 2. In this class we will be learning various softwares, one of those being Rhino. As you open Rhino 7, you'll be presented with the Rhino workspace, which on default has these four views: top, perspective, front, and right. And as I draw a box, you will see how these four views interact with this object. In the top viewport, you see the top outline of that box I drew. In the front view, and the right side of that box. In the perspective, you'll see a 3D view of that object. In order to move around in this 3D space, if you hold down the right mouse button, it will orbit in the perspective view, while in the 2D top, front, and right views, it will pan. That's how you can easily move around the space. In order to pan in perspective, you need to hold down Shift and right click. In order to maximize one of these viewports, for instance, if I want to only see the perspective viewport, you need to double left click the name perspective, and we'll maximize that viewport to where that's the only one you see. Right now, this solid box that I drew earlier is represented in wireframe, which means you're able to see all the way through the solid object. You can only see the lines that define this object. In order to make this viewport different, you need to right click on the perspective viewport or any viewport, and you can change it from wireframe to shaded. And now we see some abstract shading and a more three-dimensional solid representation of that object. There are also other viewports such as rendered, ghosted, which still is a 3D object, but is semi-transparent. Arctic is also a nice one, especially for diagrams and when you have more complex geometries. But if we go back to our four viewports, you'll notice that there's an underlying grid under. This is called the C plane or control plane. And you'll notice that there is a red axis and a green axis. The red axis is the x-axis and the green is the y-axis. You do not see the z-axis because it's only shown in the perspective, as you can see over here. Where the x, y, and z-axis meet, that is your origin point, and we can see that by clearly moving this box that we drew earlier to 0, 0, 0. Now our box is in the middle of the workspace. That being said, the closer to origin you are working in Rhino, the quicker and easier Rhino is able to process your geometries. However, that being said, Rhino is a digital workspace and it is infinite. Right? You'll also notice on the left hand side and along the top of the viewports, there are editing tool shortcuts. This is how I drew the box earlier, but it can go as far as merging things together, drawing lines. You'll also notice that in the lower right hand corner of these icons, or some of them, there is a small triangle. That is, if you right click one of these icons, it will come up with additional options. For instance, on this box, if I right click it, now there's a sphere I could draw. Okay. Rather than always using these icons though, you can always do all these commands by typing them out in the command bar, which is up here. So for instance, instead of clicking the box, I can just type box. Whenever you're doing this, it will always prompt you with a couple decisions you need to make. For instance, is it a diagonal, 3-point, vertical, or center? Let's click 3-point and see what it tells. So if we click 3-point, it's where do we want to start the edge? Then where do we want to end that edge? How wide do we want it to be? Let's just say 3. And then we enter. Then how tall do we want it to be? Let's say 4. Now we have drawn a box that is 3 wide, 4 tall. But what units are we working in right now? The default for most Rhino is millimeters. We can change the units that we're working in simply by typing units. And we'll come up with the document properties, and we can change our units to inches, which is what we'll be using for this first assignment. We want to go down to the distance display and change it to feet and inches, and then change the precision to the maximum it can be. So now that we scaled it, we can see that our previous 3 millimeter wide, 4 millimeter tall box is actually this big in inches. Rhino also has these keys at the bottom: grid snap, ortho, planar, O snap, smart track, gumball. Grid snap, if you have that turned on, whenever you're drawing an object, it will automatically snap to your grid, which could be nice, could be detrimental at times. Ortho will only allow you to draw in the orthogonal directions, the X or Y, right? Whereas prior, you can draw in any way. To temporarily turn on ortho, you can hold shift, and it will temporarily enable ortho. O-snap. O-snap refers to all of these boxes over here: end, near, point, mid, center, intersection, perpendicular, tangent, quadrant, knot, and vertex. I would recommend turning on end, near, point, mid, intersection, possibly perpendicular. All that means is whenever we are drawing objects, like I just drew this rectangle, and for instance, if I want to draw a line on this rectangle, it will, when I hover over it, it's saying this is snapping to the end point and the intersection between these two lines. But if I want to go to the middle, it automatically snaps to the midpoint of this edge of the rectangle. As you can see, what's happening here, since I already have it snapping to that midpoint, but I haven't clicked yet, it's automatically tracking the vertical point or the vertical axis of that midpoint. And that can happen for either the X or the Y axis. In order to move things, you can either tap the command move, or you can use the gumball, which is shown here in the middle of the rectangle. You can easily turn that on and off with that gumball tab at the bottom. So when the gumball is on, you're able to easily move your geometry or objects on the X or Y axis, even on the Z axis, just by holding down these arrows. You can also scale it, holding down the squares, or you can even rotate it by holding down the blue radius. At any time, if you just click one of these, you can specify the distance that you want it to be moved. For instance, if I want to move this 3 inches in this direction, it is now moved 3 inches from its original spot. If I want to scale it by 2 times what it is right now, I type 2 when I'm trying to scale. It scales it 2 times larger than it was before. In order to go back to the original rectangle, you can click Control Z, and that is the undo button for Rhino. If I want to go back and redo, it's Control Y. Let's say I have this one rectangle and I want to copy it. The simplest way you can do it is just type copy. Right? It'll ask you where you want the copy from and where you want to copy to. Once you're done, you can press enter, and now you have an exact copy of that previous original item. Let's say I want to trim this new rectangle using the original rectangle. So I can trim, select the cutting object, which is the original rectangle, press enter, and then select the object I want to trim, which is this new rectangle. All that did was basically trim that the existing geometry with the geometry that I had chosen. Another useful tool is offset. If I select this geometry and type offset, it will ask me the distance that I want the new geometry to be offset from the original. And as you can tell, if I hover my mouse outside of the highlighted geometry, it offsets it 1 inch on the exterior. If I move my mouse to the interior, it offsets it 1 inch to the interior side. So let's just do from the inside. Okay. But now let's move into the actual assignment. And so let's start from a clean slate. But I need to select these, and since I have multiple objects, we can do it in 1 or 2 ways. We can either select them all individually by holding down Shift and just selecting them like that, and then deleting, or we can draw a selection window, which is if you hold down your left mouse button and drag from the left to the right, your selection window is, as you can see, is a solid line. If you draw it from the opposite way, from the right to the left, your selection window is now dashed. Now, all this means is if it's a solid selection window, it will only select things that are within that selection window. Because this lower rectangle was not fully in that selection window, it will not be selected. On the other hand, if we drag from the right to the left and have the dash selection window, anything that that selection window crosses will be selected. Okay, so let's go ahead and delete that, and let's draw a fresh rectangle. I'm going to turn on my grid snap, and I want it to specify now that this rectangle is a 9-inch by 9-inch square. We can double check that by typing distance, and we'll always prompt you, what is the first point for distance? I'm going to select this one, the second point here. At the top, it says 9 inches. I'm going to do it again to verify that the y-axis is also 9 inches, and it is. Okay. However, when we start drawing additional lines, it can get a little confusing to understand what layers we're working on. In Rhino, we type in properties, and this is something that I would recommend doing every time you open Rhino, and have it as your default properties tab. If we select this rectangle, we can understand a little bit about it. It is a closed curve. It is on the default layer and default color, and so on and so forth. If we then type layers, oops, just layer. I would also put this at the bottom of your properties, so whenever we select anything, we understand what layer it is on and how we can change that. So in your layer tab, if we come over here and select new layer, it creates a new layer. So let's go ahead and name this square. And we can give it a red color. In order to change this rectangle now to that square layer, we can either have the square selected and right click on that new layer and change the object to that layer, which will put it on that new layer, and we can see that clearly because it's now changed colors. Or in the property tab, we can click on the layer, the drop down menu from the layer, and now select square, whichever one you find easier. Now that we're getting this set up, we can go ahead and start putting the layers that will be required for this assignment. You can create more or less if you want. So I'm going to create 6 layers, or original square, 7 layers possibly. I'm going to make another one that's called grid lines. Another one that's called heavy, which will be a heavy line weight. And then the next one is medium. then light, gray, and dash. This will make it easier for us to understand what layers we're using, they're used for. I'm going to pull the layer tab out so we can look at it more closely and understand what all of these columns mean. The first column is the layer names. The second column is what layer you currently have active. Right now we have the default layer active. That means whenever we make anything new, it will default to be on that layer, right? And we can see that clearly from the property tab. If we were to change our current layer to square and draw something new, it will now be on the square layer as a default, as you can see in the property tab. The next column is showing if the layer is on. All that means is it visible? If we were to turn off that default layer, which is where this line inside the square is shown, if we turn that off, then that line disappears. It is still there, it is still in your model, it is just not visible right now. If we were to turn it back on, it comes back. Similar thing is lock. Now that that layer is locked, it is not editable or selectable, right? But it is still visible. Color, as you saw, I turned that square layer red, and you can change all of these to any kind of color you want. Just so it's a visual cue of what objects or what geometries belong to a layer. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just change these all to their unique colors. Material will be used later on when we start developing more three-dimensional objects that need to have some kind of material. For right now, we can ignore that column. For line type, this is depicting what type of line you are drawing with. For instance, on the square, it is shown, and for all the layers, it defaults to continuous, which just means a solid line. But maybe we want the line type to be a dashed or hidden line, which is just another name for dash line. So now if we zoom into this, we can see that this line, as it's visible, is now dashed. Print color, all of these will need to be changed to black, except for the gray layer. So we can do that quickly by highlighting all of these layers, clicking on the print color, and changing it to black. We can leave the gray one as it is, shown as gray. Also to back up our dash line, we can change that to hidden. All the other ones can stay continuous. For the print width, this is where we start deciding what line weights we're going to use. How heavy or thick are your lines and how light are they? Okay. For the grid and square lines, since those are just construction lines or guidelines, we don't necessarily need to print those. We can leave them at default. For the heavy, which is the thickest line, we can go ahead and move that to 2, which is 2 millimeters. For medium, we can change that to 0.8. For light, which is the lightest line weight, we can change that to 0.13. And for these other two, the gray and the dashed, we can combine those and or select both of those together and change those to 0.8. So if we start drawing some lines in here, using the commands that we talked about earlier, I'm going to move our layer tab back to where its home is. We can start drawing these grid lines, these guidelines, at these grid intersections. We know these grid intersections are all happening 1 inch away from each other. But maybe we want to make this a little bit quicker. So we can copy these two lines, choose the point that we want to copy from, and start copying. Right? Now we have all of our y-axis guidelines done. Let's start with the x-axis ones. And again, we can use one of those commands we learned earlier, offset, and start offsetting it 1 inch at a time. Similar thing, we can select multiple of these lines and offset them. But now our distance is no longer 1, it would be 4 because we're offsetting it. Apologies, let me do that again. Select all of them and type offset. Select the curves that we want to offset. And now we can offset that 4 inches. Now that we have our guidelines drawn, we can start creating the pattern. That was the whole objective of the assignment. For instance, I'm going to choose the linear organization and the gradation design. So I am starting a heavy line here. I'm going to draw this gray line as a reference for my linear organization. So all of my lines will be linearly organized along this gray line. Okay? Let's say I want to offset my main heavy line 1 inch away. Okay? Now this heavy line, I need to change it to medium so I can start showing how it gradates. And I'm going to offset this again, 1 inch, and I'll change that to the light line. Let's do it one more time. And change this one to the dashed. Maybe I use the dashed line as a signifier for the gradation to start over. And we can assume like all of these will again continue. Or so on and so forth. However, now all these lines are actually protruding out from our 9x9 square. So in order to trim those away, We can trim, select that given square, enter, and now we select the objects we want to trim, which is everything outside of the rectangle. Since this does not intersect, we can just delete it. Now you may be wondering how this actually looks when you print it rather than all of these colors. And we can easily see that whenever we go to View, the top left, and go to Print Preview. Now this is how all these lines would actually look if we were to print it right now. But if we were to print it and we, Control P, the shortcut for print, it is just printing on an 8.5 by 11, no scale, nothing, no text. It is just what we see in the moment. In order to kind of be more intentional in how we want to lay out our project, at the bottom left, previously those 4 layouts, right, they're shown here. There's 4 viewports: perspective, top, front, and right. At the right side of the right viewport, there's this plus. If we click it, it is prompting us to select one of these, and we want to click New Layout. We want to specify that the printer will be Rhino PDF, because we just need a PDF. And it's going to be on 11 by 17 tabloid in the landscape orientation. Just double check that, 17 and 11. We can rename this pattern 1. And press OK. Now we see this pattern, this layout. Right now, our 9 square grid is centered in this layout, which is okay, but maybe we actually want it to be a little bit smaller and justified to the left of the page. In order to activate that layout, you just double click it, and now it is basically like you're working in the top view again. I think there is a nice placement, so let's double click again to deactivate the layout. And now the line work is frozen in place. But let's add some text. And I'm just going to put that on the default layer for now. So if we type text, the text box comes up with all of these options. Let's go ahead and change the height to 10 millimeters, the font to anything that you desire. Let's just try to make it something that's simple, modern, and easy to read. So I'm just going to do the Arial black, and you are able to italicize, underline, justify it any way you want. And here is the text box for actually inputting your text. I'm going to call this pattern number 1. And I'm going to place it here. I want to copy that down. And to easily edit the text, again, we can look at our Properties tab. And this is the same thing that was shown when we were first creating the text. What font, what size, and what text you want to be shown. So underneath pattern, let's describe the 2 organization methods that we were using, which was linear organization gradation. But that looks pretty large in comparison to the title. So what we can do is scale it using the gumball. If we hold shift, it scales in both directions. If we don't, it scales in one direction, right? So we hold shift and we want to say it's like about that size, right? Now we have the title of this pattern and the two methods that we use to create it. The assignment still needs us to add our name, course number, assignment number, and the date of delivery. So I will just copy this previous text box and oops, that's got too big. I will select that text box, put your name, the course number, 63-03, the assignment number, which is assignment 1, part 1, and then the date of delivery, which is January 5th, 2024. So I'll put these all in the same text box. Maybe I don't want to do that. I'm going to go ahead and copy this over. Maybe in this first text box, I just want my name and the course number. And then in the second text box, I want the assignment number and the date. Again, this is all up to you. This is where your design comes through. So if I were to print, it would now show that 11 by 17 layout that we just created with all of the correct line weights and colors that we have originally decided on. Okay, but before I click print, I want to turn off those grid lines as they were just guidelines. They weren't actually lines that we're using to show the pattern. So I can turn off that layer, and when I print, they are no longer showing it. It's just clearly showing the pattern I created. You'll also notice that we're now printing on that 11 by 17 layout, which was determined earlier. And we can double check that by looking over here and seeing what view we were looking at. If we were to go back to that top view that we were looking at earlier, it's just floating in space, not bounded by anything. But if we go down to the layout that we created, which was pattern number 1, we'll see the layout that we created. So I'm going to click print, and in order to easily find your files and keep track of your assignments, we are requesting everyone to label their files accordingly, which is your last name, the assignment number, which is assignment 1-1 for part 1, the date this is due, which is January 25th, year 24. And then since this is our first pattern, we're just going to label it A. And you can do this for each pattern. So pattern 2 would be B, pattern 3 would be C. Let's go ahead and save that. So go find it, right? This is how it looks when it's printed, which should be very similar to how everyone else is working. But now that I mentioned it, since we're doing 3 iterations and for 3 different patterns, but we only have one layout, how do we easily create those other layouts to where they follow the same template that you created for the first one? What we can do is right click down here where we created this pattern. If we right click pattern number 1, we can select this move or copy. And then make sure you create a copy. And now we have this pattern number 1 copy. We can rename that to pattern number 2. And, edit the text accordingly. But we are still looking at the original pattern, right? So if we go back to our top view layout, and I'm just going to quickly copy this over. Let's say go about there, and go back to our pattern number 2. If we activate the layout, we can then move around in the space again. So if I right click and hold shift, it pans in a straight line. So we keep it in the same x-axis. Let's say it's about there, right? Let's delete these 2 just to make sure we have a new pattern. And so if we switch between pattern 1 and pattern 2, you will notice that they are different. Repeat that process for pattern 3. Right? Move or copy, create a copy, rename it, pattern 3, and then we can rename the text, pattern 3. And again, pan to the new pattern, which right now it's not there. I believe that is everything for this first tutorial. Please work through as much as you can. Come to class on Tuesday with questions and problems that we can troubleshoot together to get the pattern that you desire. That's it. Everyone have a great weekend and hope to see you in class Tuesday.